Hey guys, Ryan from Spyker Workshop, and here I have the assembly video for how to put together the new Spyker Cat 2X. The 2X stands for that it is 2 times larger than the original one. So there's quite a lot of things to go over, so sorry if the video kind of jumps all over the place. But the first thing I want to talk about is that if you buy the kit from me, your kit will come with the aluminum transmission, but if you want to print your own, you have the option to print this. I have not tested it printed myself, but you will be able to purchase these two products individually if you're trying to print your own cat. So you don't need the transmission, but is very highly recommended. Also, it might be a little confusing because during this assembly video, I will be using the aluminum hull upgrade, which is an optional upgrade. The assembly for the plastic hull is almost identical. I'll be pointing out the differences as we go. It's mainly just different screws, like these are machine threaded screws. The plastic version is sheet metal screws, but I'll show you all the differences as we get going. So the very first thing you should do to start assembling the cat is there's a drill guide that is included. You can download this on my website if you're trying to print one of your own, or it's included in the file folder. But there's 2 pages. This shows how to drill out and countersink the plastic hull. All these pieces are the same parts that the aluminum hull upgrade offers, but that upgrade comes already pre-countersunk and everything. Just quickly wanted to go over just to try and help if it's confusing to some people, but I have it so all the triangles are first drill a hole in that color and then countersink it, and then some of these I circled and put exclamations by where like all these holes are being countersunk from the top, but then these holes are, you flip the plate over and countersink them from the other side. You just gotta kind of watch as you're going, because it's hard to communicate all that information, you know. Let me know if you guys have any issues too, because I can always update this. And then also keep an eye on the fact that there's a right and a left side, and they all have mirrored countersink holes as it goes down. And then the first page is not quite so complicated. There's only a couple countersinks here. But yeah, so the way it works is I recommend getting yourself some kind of drill bit set like this that has all sorts of the sizes needed. And then on the guide here it shows, it's like by color coding what drill bit to use on what hole. And the most confusing parts on here are these 4 main hull components. These 4 here. So here I have these 2 in hand. And the only thing that's confusing about them is here's the right one and here's the left one. So some of the holes on the left one also get drilled on the right side, but you can't see them on the picture. But, you know, copy everything that you do and mirror it over. So like on these, you can see the holes are already started in the plastic. You just need to use the drill to enlarge the holes. That's the whole purpose of this whole drill guide. If you print the holes at the right size, it just varies so much, and it's not like a nice hole for the screws that I use. So I'm going to go ahead and drill out all these parts following the drill guide. And then after that, I'm going to unpack the hardware to continue on the assembly. I would definitely recommend drilling most of the holes with a drill press if you have a machine like this. It makes it so much easier on yourself. It's just drilling through plastic like this is so much easier with this thing. So here's an example of why we have to drill out all these parts in the first place. When you 3D print something, you can kind of see here, they have perimeters, what they call it. So these parts, they have 2 perimeters on the outside, which means that all the holes also have 2 perimeters. And then it does like a zigzag infill pattern on the inside. So if I had these holes larger to print at the correct size, you actually have a like loss of material that actually connects them together, because the perimeters can't fit a total of 4 in here, if that makes sense. It really only affects it on holes that are close to the edges of parts like these, but drilling them out afterwards allows the print to be stronger and allow a better screw connection. So if you don't have a drill press, I highly recommend getting at least some kind of powered cordless drill. I personally love and use this drill like crazy. It's DeWalt. It's extremely small, but it's just enough power for drilling and screwing in stuff that I sell. And the torque control is really sweet. So like if you're tightening in a number 4 sheet metal screw, you can put this to number 4, and that's like a pretty good tension for it. Same with number 6 and even up to number 8 size sheet metal screws. It's almost like they engineered the torque setting just for that. It's pretty sweet. But I wanted to show you a slightly difficult part to drill through. One of the drive pulleys. This thing uses a 3/32 all the way through, and it's a little challenging because the drill is about the size of the hole, or the depth of the hole. But you just have to go in and out several times and just clear the plastic off the drill bit. You can't go through it all in one go because the flutes can't evacuate the chips once it goes too deep. About 3 or 4 times or so for each hole. Yeah, there we go. And then there's 4 of them to do on there. There's 4 of these that are a 1/4 inch drill bit. Pretty much the length of the drill. There's not too much plastic that actually needs to be removed. I would actually go in from each side just to make sure it's drilled out. So one last drill to mention. Don't forget to drill out the 3 headlights. There's on all 4 pieces. Either drill it at 5mm if you have that kind of drill bit. Otherwise go up a little bit to like a 13/64, somewhere around there. Just don't forget to drill those, because later if we put the lens covers on, which I did this on the first one, I glued the lens covers on before I drilled them, and then a ton of drill dust got inside, so I had to take them all back apart and stuff. So I have all my parts drilled out and ready to move on with assembly, and I wanted to start out with the most confusing part, which is that in this assembly video I'll be putting together the aluminum hull upgrade, which is a separately sold optional part. But you might have ordered just the plastic hull, which works just fine. All of the videos of the blue and orange one are just with a plastic hull. But there's just a few differences in assembly, not very many, but I'm going to go over them here, because one of the first steps is actually putting together the plastic hull. Well, I'll give you this just broad view just to show you the comparisons, just to try and make it less confusing. But this is the whole plastic hull. This is what the machine will come with if you do not order a aluminum hull upgrade from me. And the only differences are that these plates are in 3 pieces and the floor is in 3 pieces, and that they use slightly different hardware, like the screws on the ends are sheet metal screws instead of machine screws. And then the other version, the aluminum one, very similar, but it just uses different screws on the ends, and all the pieces are in one continuous length, so you don't need these extra spacers to connect the hulls together. So it's very similar, just a couple differences. But it's held together with some printed parts. And if you're assembling the plastic hull, the screws that you'll need are some of these number 632 3/4 pan, go right here, with some number 6 washers, and then on the back side some washers and 632 lock nut right here. The top is slightly different because the front is countersunk, so it will be the 632 3/4 flat, and then the same lock nut and washer on the back. And then the rear of the hull is slightly different. It's the same as the front, also using a 1/4 20 by 1 inch flat, and that's this one right here. And then on the other side we're using a nylon washer, or a spacer, and then on top of that the 1/4 20 lock nut. And keep in mind that none of this you have to do if you bought the aluminum upgrade hull from me. So the next part to assemble, if you're building the plastic hull version, is you'll need a bunch of these number 6 by 5/8 flat, and we're screwing on these plastic plates to the hull brackets. You can see here like this. And on the hull part there's extra holes. There's 2 on each post there, and that's because on each side you're going to stagger it. So like this screw goes here, and then the other screw is slightly offset on the other side. If you see when I turn it invisible there, you can see how the screws go. And then there's 2 of these to assemble. So to assemble the aluminum hull version, it's pretty much the same thing, except you're using a machine screw instead of a sheet metal screw. And these plates, all these plates will come countersunk for you if you buy this upgrade. Same with these big aluminum hull brackets, will come pre-tapped with all the threads that you need and everything. But yeah, so these I'll use the screws and then like stagger them front and back so they don't run into each other, and put these plates on both sides like this. So here's with all 4 plates attached. And the plastic versions are almost identical, just plastic instead of aluminum. So let's set these aside for now. Most of the confusing stuff's out of the way, so I'm going to go ahead and unpack the hardware. So I got most of the hardware unpacked. Your kit will come with a printed hardware page, and all the hardware is to scale on that page. So if you have a hard time finding what screw to use, it's all the like scale size. Also, I want to quick mention that there will be a actual paper instruction manual in the future, but for the time being this instructional video is all that I'm offering for how to put this thing together. The main reason is that making a video like this only takes me like 2 or 3 days. Making a paper manual takes me like 2 months of solid work. By the time I finished it, it would not, I mean, it would be in the middle of spring. So I'm trying to get this out. So our next step here is using this hardware shown. 14 of these, 4 of these, and 4 of those. And then also the hull plates. Yours will either be aluminum or the plastic version, which we talked about earlier. And then the sprocket pieces and the suspension mount pieces. So first we can start with screwing these into the plates. There is a right and left. They're slightly different shapes. But these, I'm going to line up the holes here. So before you actually screw that down, I almost forgot. One of the large bearings that's with the kit goes in here first. Goes in the plastic part like that, because this hole is slightly undersized to keep it from falling out. So if you screw this on before then, you'll have to take it back apart. So one thing I actually changed since I recorded the assembly video is that if you buy the hardware kits from me for the cat, two of these plates will come with the hardware along with the transmission plates, and these will beef up just the area around the sprocket. And these won't be included if you ordered the aluminum hull upgrade, but if you just got the printed stuff, this significantly helps reinforce the area around the sprocket. And the drill guide is the exact same as this. You use the same drill holes through this part here. It will just go on top of this, so it gets sandwiched in between, like this. Other than that, the assembly is the exact same. You know, where you feed the screws in the back. And don't forget the bearing in that part, like I almost did there. So it should be like that. And one thing that's nice about using a small drill like this is the clutch setting. You can set low enough to not strip out the plastic. Because one thing, if you're not used to assembling stuff like this, is I use sheet metal screws, which have a pretty coarse thread, so it can really hold on to plastic. But you still can't go crazy and like over tighten them, because if you go too tight, it will strip out the plastic. But you can go pretty tight, but just keep that in mind to not go crazy on some of these. I also will tend to go over them once more with a hand screwdriver. These large screws you're not going to be able to strip out, but the smaller sheet metal screws you easily can. But the number 6s are pretty hard to do that. So I'll do the same thing on the other side with the other one. Don't forget the bearing. So the next step is to take 4 3/8 lock nuts, and these get preloaded in the back of these parts with the lock ring facing towards us like this. And then make sure those don't fall out. And these parts will be mounted to the hull. If you see where you put the sprocket mount on the outside, these go on the same side as that. And then they go like this here, with these pockets are facing down. And then from the back side, we're going to put the number 8 by 1.5" screw with a washer on the back in the upper hole here. And these screws, they're really long, but that's because these bear a lot of the load of the whole cat, so it needs to go all the way through. But these are kind of challenging to screw in because it takes so much force. But try to not strip them and use, like I use a really high torque on this thing actually. Let's see how well it goes here. Also, make sure that that lock nut doesn't fall out. Yeah, those are definitely hard to put in. Or hang it off the edge of the table so you can put more downward force on the drill. Some screws like that I wouldn't try to drive in by hand. I would definitely use some kind of a power drill and make sure that you have the right bit for the screw. But I'm going to do the same thing to all 4 here, just in that upper hole. And don't forget the lock nuts on the back side. Yeah, a little bit of an easier way is to actually prop it up on something so that you're able to use more downward force on the screw. You can always get it tight and then loosen it a little bit because the part will probably spin on you, but I'll continue doing the other 2. So this is the hardware we need for the next step here. And the really complex looking big hull pieces will be connecting to the main hull. So first thing to do is figure out which side goes where. So this side will go on the other side here. This one goes over here. And then these two will get mounted right here. You can tell they line up because of this groove here. So I'm going to use these screws to screw them in here. These really long ones will go on these two holes, and then the rest of these screws will go here, here, and then on the back side they all use the shorter screws. It would be 4 of them here, 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 and here. So I'm going to screw those in. So doing these long screws is actually pretty difficult also. They're so long, also again to reinforce the plastic. A lot of these changes were made to the mini cat, scaled up to the big one, which will have the same benefit. But with these smaller number 4 sheet metal screws, make sure you're using a smaller Phillips bit on them. Should look like this by now here. So this is what we need for the next step. So if you look in your hull here, there's a groove right here and here. So you want to line up the groove and then check to see if the holes line up, which they do on this part. So that's the one that goes there. You can see the groove is the opposite on these. So it's this one. And then it will be the opposite for these on the other side. 3 screws to do on this. So there's one from the top here. This one will be the really long 2-inch screws. Make sure to put washers on them also. But this screw will be driven all the way through into that black part. And then from the other side, these two will use the slightly shorter 1.5-inch screws. And then I'll do that for all of them here. So here I have one done. You can see I got those screws in like that. And this main plate here is what actually bears like the whole weight of the snowcat. The metal will help too, obviously, but the plastic version doesn't really need it as much, just because the way I designed it, it's like really weird interlocking structural components. Like you can see, even though it's on the layer lines, like just the strength of these parts is like insane. Like everything I do is printed with 1.2 nozzle, like for this at least, and it's just crazy. All of my prints are solid too on this. I use 100% infill. I don't use any of that weird lattice stuff on the inside. Like all this stuff is just strong. So one other thing I quick wanted to talk about is that just because this is 3D printed does not mean that the plastic is actually bearing the whole load of the machine when you got like weight on it. The way that it's engineered is the screws themselves are what's the most strength on the machine. You can't really tell, but the really long 2-inch that we put in here comes all the way up to the front, and that one that we put in earlier underneath also comes right up to the front. And the nut, hopefully you guys didn't forget to put the nut in there, because it's a lot of screws to remove if you forgot. But that big 3/8-inch hex nut is way back here. So those 2 screws are like clamping the plastic around that hex nut, basically. So the only way for these parts to break is if both of these screws broke. You know, it's not really depending on the plastic strength, which is, I guess, a lot of features of my designs. You know, it's relying on hardware strength. So for this middle plate that goes here, one thing too is if your parts don't fit together that nice, it's probably because the end is just slightly like out. What you can do is just file down the end of that a little bit to make it straight. The number 4 by 3/4 and washers, so I'm going to attach that. It's just 3 holes, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, everything that we've done so far. So this is what we need for the next step. And then to screw these in, the front one takes different screws than the rear. So let's check this one out first here. So the front takes 3 really long screws, here, here, and here. And then one of the flatheads go here. And make sure to use the washers on those. And these, you can kind of tell, these are those really long screws again. This one's going all the way here, and this one's going all the way to here. So you have 2 bands of metal basically reinforcing the front hull plate here. Is similar. We use one of the long screws for here, and then 2 of the flatheads go here. So far the entire hull should look like this. We have the big right and left halves here. One other thing is, it's up to you if you want to put these on now or wait, because they will get in the way of the rest of the construction. So the next step is to actually connect these plates that we did earlier to the bottom. Almost identical for the plastic version, but I'm doing the aluminum here. For the plastic version you'll be using this screw, but for the aluminum version, the screws that came in the kit, the machine screws. So next step is, if you're building the plastic hull version, we're going to be connecting the printed brackets to the main floor. And the way we do that is using several of these screws, and we attach them on the bottom like so. And they're kind of staggered, so the floor comes in 3 parts for the plastic version, and you'll be using 6 screws on each plate to connect them together like this. So for the aluminum version, it's almost identical, except we're using some 632 machine screws instead. One side is countersunk. That's the side that goes like this here. And then we'll be putting in the 4 screws there and 4 here. So here I have the plates screwed to the floor like that. So next step, if you're using the plastic hull, is to use these screws. And then we're going to connect the assembly that we've been working on to the side of the hull brackets like this. And that will be on all the sides like that. So for both the plastic and the aluminum version, the floor plate has 4 holes on the front, not on the rear. So you'll want to line those up to the front, which has the sprocket on. And unlike the mini cat, you can use this in like this being the front or this being the front, but the main difference is there's not enough space to fit the batteries next to the transmission up here, because you need to, the lifting mechanic for the blower takes up so much space. So if you have it on this end, you lose like a ton of battery space, because you can't have the transmission and the blower lifting thing back here with enough space for batteries still. So it's like a trade-off. For this version, like, this should be the front. 1/4 inch flathead screws that come in the hull upgrade kit. So these screws will go in here, and I would recommend using some thread locker on these. So next step is using a ton of these screws, and these screws we'll be using to finish connecting the floor plate. So if we flip the machine around, pretty much every hole, in fact I think every hole you see here, all these countersunk holes get one of these screws. So the next step is using the same screws that we used to put the floor down, and these plates. I have a rear plate that has, it's just a solid cover. That one goes in the back, like so. And then this one is used to house the snowblower, the actuator for the snowblower that raises it up and down. On my website, when you check out for this, I'll have options I'll basically make it so you can buy these individually. In case you don't want to run the snowblower, then you can just run 2 flat covers. So I quick wanted to talk about an accessory that is being sold separately for this machine. This is a trailer hitch that works with many different ride-on lawnmower attachments, like trailers, those dump trailers, salt spreaders. There's quite a few other different options for ride-on lawnmowers, but this makes it compatible with it. And it's a simple upgrade that will change out the back plate to be this instead, and then this part gets mounted on top. So just to quickly go over how to assemble it, you'll remove these screws and remove the 4 on the bottom. Take this plate off, and then you'll replace it with the same screws from up underneath in the new one. And then instead of these bolts, you're going to use these longer bolts here. Let me zoom in so you can see all this stuff. And the longer bolts take the place, and there will not be a washer on the inside, it's only a nut, which will be right here and here. And then after you have that installed, so the upgrade is attached now. Last thing to do is connect the aluminum plate up here. So it will be the number 8 1-inch screws on the back here, and then the flatheads down the middle. So I'll go and attach that. And here is the hitch attached and ready to use. Most of those ride-on accessories have like a simple pin mechanism. It's really easy to hook stuff up. Check out my other videos on my channel, because I have a couple videos of the other Snowcat operating some of those accessories. And in the future, depending on what other attachments I come out with, there'll probably be multiple different plates with, you know, different things on them. But these, they take 4 screws up from under the bottom of the plate. And then next up, we'll be running in the last piece for the front here. So next step, we're going to put in the hull reinforcement bolts using these screws here. And these bolts will reinforce the whole hull pretty much. They go here to kind of connect it, and here in all 4 corners, and then also down below. And then we also need these 2 printed parts. So we use 4 of the 4.5-inch bolts with washers on each side and a lock nut. And then we're going to be putting them all the way through like that, well, with the washer on it. And if yours doesn't fit that easily, you can always put the 1/4-inch drill back on and run the drill through, and it kind of makes the holes line up. So then washer and lock nut. And then tighten it decently, but don't go too crazy. It's just to kind of clamp the front end. So I'll do that on the 4 corners. Then we use 4-inch ones, and these will go through the front here. Those screws will come out right here. You only need a lock nut on this side. You don't need to put a washer on the inside. So I have those 2 installed now. And the main purpose of these is just to reinforce this whole front end. These will prevent this piece from ever cracking. So using the other 2 4.5, there's a right and left to these parts. You can line them up with the holes here. We'll use a washer through the middle here, and then through here, with no washer on the end, just the lock nut. Now that we have the back idlers on, oh, there is my actual cat checking out my Snowcat. That's Tiki. Next step, we'll be using the giant 3/8 by 2.5 inch hex bolts, and the fiber washers and 3/8 bearings. And we're going to be mounting the suspension arms, well, swing arms, there really is no suspension on these things, to keep the payload for the maximum weight. It's all like rigid. It's kind of rigid suspension, but it still has some play to it to conform to the ground, you know, but there's no springs or anything on it. But yeah, to assemble this, so we'll take a bolt and fiber washer, and then a bearing, and that goes in the front like this here. And then on the other side, same thing, a bearing, and these might, the fit might be a little tight. If it is, you can take an X-Acto knife and just clean up the upper ring until you can get that to fit. You might even need to file it a little bit. Once you get it to fit, then put another fiber washer on the back side. That prevents the bearing from not being able to turn. The nuts that we put in here, like way back in the assembly video, they should feed right in. So just tighten it until it's close, and then you want it, like, see, that's too tight right there because it's not able to spin on its own. So if I loosen it just enough here, yeah. So now that we have those on, the next step is to do the idlers using this hardware. And the first thing to do is take 2 of the 3/8 nuts and preload them in the back of these parts. Oops, I'll put them both in each one. After you have the nuts in there, then we're going to take these screws here with the washer, and then put the screw through this part like that, and then screw it on to this hole here. Do that on both sides, and don't forget the nut before you put this part on. Once you have those on, the next step is to take the large 3.5 inch, and then that will go through here with no washer on it. And then for this side, you can kind of bend this part back up like that, and then this will go through here. You can see the screw is exposed a little, and there's a nut trap in there, so you can screw that in. So I have that bolt in, and I flipped the machine over because the other remaining screw here, 2.5 inch one with a washer and lock nut, and then there's a hole back here. You'll line up that track with that, like here, and then you can see on the other side there's a nut trap, which is the same right here. So we'll go ahead and screw that together. So once you have that, I like to tighten it all the way down, and then just back it off like a full turn or even half a turn or something. And then this will eventually be used to adjust the track tension, because the rear wheel will be right here. So this is how you know, if your track is too slack, you would loosen this bolt and then tighten it, or loosen it and then tighten that bolt again. For now, put it all the way forward so you have enough room to get the tracks on later. So next up is the wheels, which are fairly simple. There are 2 halves. One of them is like solid like this, the other one has some grooves like this. These are, you know, the front and back halves. And we'll take a tire and then you just kind of line up the holes, and the screws will go in from this side with the notches, and it uses that one there. and then just screw those all down, and then there's 10 of them total to do. So I have all 10 wheels assembled now. Next is to attach them using this hardware here. The 3/8 by 3" hex bolts, 3/8 nuts, fiber washers, and the 3/8 bearing. And the first thing is to preload the nuts in the back of these swing arms here. And then the screw, put a fiber washer on first, and then put the bearings in the wheel. And you can choose which side you want the wheel facing. You can either do it this way or this way. So with that fiber washer on, I'm going to have them like this. And then from the back, put another fiber washer on. And then make sure it catches that nut on the back side. And then I'm going to tighten it down just snug, and then back it off so the wheel spins freely. Should spin super freely like that. So then I'll go ahead and do all 10. It's the same exact process for the rear also, except we preloaded that nut already. So now I have all 10 wheels on, and the chassis is almost done. The next step will be to start assembling the transmission so we can get the sprockets in here. One thing to quick talk about before we start the transmission, because it's a good time before it gets in the way, is if you bought the electronics kit from me, which will be covered in a separate video, you will have received a light kit in there, which is 4 packages of lights, and that's only just for the lower hull. Some of the lights are not used, but we'll go over all that. Make sure that you have drilled out your holes for the lights with a 5mm drill, or somewhere around there against the wall. So in the front, the lenses that go outside, these are included in your kits, and these actually come with the hardware kits, so even if you're printing your own, I include a set of the clear lenses. The yellow lenses go on the outside, and the clear on the inside. So you'll want to take your lights here and run the 2 white ones in those 2 holes. And then there are no orange lights, so it's up to you which to use. I was using the red. You can cut these off if you don't want them, or you can put them just laying in the hull somewhere, but it's nice to have some light on the inside of the machine, so you could even like tape them to the wall or something. And then you also have a extra red one up front, which you can do whatever you want with. So here I have just a super simple hot glue gun, and the easiest way to do this is just apply a little bead around the side of the light, and then quickly before it starts to dry, use a little screwdriver to push it all the way down in the hole. And then if, or when you get it down on the bottom of the hole, if you put some pressure on it just for a couple seconds till it dries, it'll make sure the light is flat against here, so it's, you know, pointing straight ahead. And then I'll just continue to do that for the next few here. So I have the front lights all glued in here, and now I can figure out what to do with the extra lights. You can either clip them off or put them inside your hull or even outside. It's really up to you guys, depending on what color scheme that you went with. And then don't forget to zip tie the wires to these posts like this, so nothing is hanging in this space right here, because this is where the pulley will be. So this is how I recommend routing the front wires for now until we get farther in the build. I actually hot glued my lights, which one of them actually just fell down on me. I'll have to re-glue that. But I glued my lights here facing forwards. That way, because the transmission will cover them up, but the underneath of the transmission will kind of glow red. Should look pretty sweet. But I zip tied them here, and don't run any wires underneath here, because they'll actually get in the way of the pulley. So leave them out in the middle like this, so the transmission can fit right here. So the rear lights, I flipped the machine around, are very similar to the front, except the fact that it has a red lens on the inside and an orange on the outside. So I'm going to use 2 of the red lights for these 2 holes, and then I'm going to use a white light to go behind the orange lens, which still looks fine on the outside. So here's how I have the back laid out. I kind of folded the wires back over and then zip tied them here, and I put one of the blue lights there and then another blue light up here. Your light kits will come with a bunch of random wires, and these single wires will be connecting to here. But in order to route these wires underneath the floor, flip the machine over. So here I have routed the wires underneath the floor panel. So now I'll take the extension wire, which will connect to here. And then also in the electronics kit come some really long servo extensions, which will then be plugged into here. And then this part has to be routed down through this floor panel, and then from here it will eventually get routed up to the electrical box. The main electrical circuitry will be in a little box right here. So there I have the wires routed through, and for now we can just leave them laying here until we get to the whole electronics kit, which will be in a separate video. But we had to get the lights out of the way because it is very difficult to do this after everything else is installed in here. So now that we have all 4 corners of the lights installed, and all the wires meeting in the middle here, in those wire kits they all came with a Y harness, and we need to use all 4 of them here to connect these together. There's probably an easier way to do this, but this is just the way that I found. So we're going to plug in the 2 front red ones into this harness, and then we will plug in, even though these don't actually fit, you can make them fit. Just make sure to line up the correct, negative to positive, but they do fit in here like that. And then the other wire of this will fit into here. And then these 2 wires will be plugged into here. And then since this wire doesn't connect to a receiver nicely, we can just use the last Y splitter, which then we have either option to connect or connect something else in the future, because all these lights run on 5 volts. There are still 2 more of these cables left over also, so you can use one of these to just plug in a 5-volt battery. And this is the result for this particular setup of the colors that I chose. So it's using the blue lights in the back, and then blue lights hidden under here, and the red lights, which I think looks pretty sweet. And then we still have to put the lenses on, which is the next step. So next we'll glue the lights on. I'm using some of this like pipe ABS glue. It needs to be something for ABS. Super glue also works, but is a little more fragile. But all I'm going to do is just glue the lenses in like that. The white one first, or red one if you're doing the back side. It's the exact same. And then there is a right and left to the orange one. So now I have the lenses installed, front and back, and now it is time for the transmission. So here are all the parts you'll need for the transmission assembly, and we're going to break it down step by step here of what screws you need. But keep in mind throughout this whole transmission part that there's a right and left to each transmission, and they're both identical, just mirrored. So I'll only be focusing on one side, and then everything I do, you will reverse it to the other side. So this is what you need for the first step here. On the back side of these two countersunken holes, I'll screw these in here, and then same with that one here. Notice that the slots are on the top. Both motors that we'll be assembling, just make sure that these are facing up. Next, using the same screws, we'll be using a lot of these for the transmission. There's a right and left side of the plate, so this plate we'll be using this shape, so like these slots are up, and this, like where this angles, this is the top. So this part will go like that. Next, we're going to be putting these parts on this hull, and this plate is the opposite of what is on here already. These were countersunk, so make it line up, and then the plate where these are countersunk. And this piece, there's a right and left. This side is going to be the right side of the transmission, so this is the right half. So I'll put that on the bottom here and screw those in, and then this part goes on the top here like this. Next, we're going to use these aluminum arm looking pieces with this hardware, and what we'll be doing is on the other side here where there's one countersunken hole, that will be the flathead, and then we'll line up the plate with that slot that's in the wall here, like this. This is how you'll adjust the tension on the middle belt. And then I'll use a washer and a nut. And then on the top, I will use the panhead screw from the back with a washer on it, and washer and nut on the inside. So here's with those parts attached. And you can tighten the bottom one down, but leave the top one just slightly loose, because you want to be able to slide it like this. And these will be installed just like this, facing up on those four holes, and then same with on the back side, facing up. Next we'll be using these screws here, and that pinion, oh wait, nope, that's the wrong size. And we'll be putting these all the way through the motor pinion here. So I got those screws in, and next up we'll be using the 3/8 bearings, and these will get fitted on the top and bottom of all these, and it might take a little bit of filing on the printed part to get them to fit. So next step here, we'll be using this hardware and all these pieces, also the belts. So this step is a little complicated where it kind of all comes together. So we'll start with this piece here and these bolts, and we'll feed them in through the other side like this on both holes here. And then on just this side we'll feed in one fiber washer, and then on this side your kit will have a couple printed spacers. We'll use the thicker one on this side, put a fiber washer on there also, which will make it ride on just the inner ring of the bearings so it doesn't get bound up at all. For this side we're going to put on the metric pulley like this. This part on the smaller pulley, put the giant belt, and then put this on like this here, and then this belt will connect the top like that. So first put a fiber washer on both of these on the top, And then the printed thinner spacer goes on that one, like that. Make sure as you lift it up that you keep the bolts from falling out on the back side. And then just kind of slowly work it together and adjust the space on each of those so they're even. And it should look somewhat like this. So you got the thin washer, the fiber washer, fiber washer, fiber washer, and then one more fiber washer with the thick spacer over there. We'll put the same screws that we've been using, 2 here and then 2 on the bottom to hold it together. And I just temporarily put the nuts on just to hold the bolts from falling out. So using the same parts, the fiber washers and spacers and belts, I already have it started here. So fiber washer goes on this side, large spacer with the washer on top on this side. Put this part like that. Put the metric belt around it. And then this side, the big belt facing down. Fiber washer on this side. Fiber washer on this side. They always go against the bearings. And then thin spacer. Put the belt on also. And the reason that there's so much thread sticking out is because these screws are partially threaded, and I had to over lengthen them just to make sure that the partial thread is inside the bearing, because it's a tighter fit on these then versus having the bearing ride the threads screws on these to finish tightening it together. And just to show you, don't forget the little screw that goes here. So next we'll be using the rest of the small parts and those same screws, and there's kind of like an offset hole to go against the wall here like this. So these offset holes are towards the front of the transmission, and then after you get those screwed in, then these will be screwed in on top of those parts. I have the bars installed now, and the only thing left to do is tighten these down. Go until they like rub against the frame, but like don't tighten them so they're squishing the aluminum. You just want it so they're not loose, so you don't hear them like rattling around while you're driving. So next step is to adjust the tension on this belt, which is done by adjusting these. But after you tighten this side down, then line this side up so it's approximately at the same, and then tighten that side down. And do that to both. Also, one thing to note, if you tightened this bolt a little too much, then you won't really be able to adjust the tension on the belt. So loosen this a little bit to allow yourself to adjust it. So I have both sides tensioned and tightened. So this belt should be really firm, as long as you didn't, go crazy and put like 100 pounds of force or something on it to tighten it. Just a firm pressure to keep it like tight, and you should be able to freely spin it. Like, it shouldn't have very much resistance to it. If your belt is really hard to move, like it's binding or something, you might have forgotten to put the fiber washers down there. So next, a quick talk about motors. The electronics kit that I sell will come with 2 of these amp flow motors. M27150P. P stands for pinion instead of a sprocket. And the transmission plates are set up to use these specific motors because they have a 3-hole bolt pattern. It's just kind of odd, but they're really good motors. If you guys want to run other motors while you're ordering the stuff from me, you can email me and let me know, because I'm open to machining different bracket types depending on what motors you guys want to run, because it's easy for me to just draw a new bolt pattern. But these motors work really good. They go up to 36 volts and they're 1/5 horsepower, and we'll be putting them on using these M5 bolts. But before we do that, one last thing. There is a nut trap right here, down in here. This screw holds the nut in place, so it's 1/4 inch lock nut that we will drop in place here. And it gets pushed down in there, and it wouldn't hurt to use one of these 1/4-inch bolts just to make sure it's lined up. I'm just going to feed it in just the thread part of it. You can see it in there. And then from this side, I'll put that screw back in, and that will hold that nut in place. So I have the nut in place now. And the whole purpose of this part is, once we get it installed inside the machine, there's a bolt that you tighten, and this will slide the transmission back and forth, and that is how you tension the main tension on the big belt here. So these motors just kind of slide in here and put the belt over them. And then start with the bottom hole. Make sure to use just a little bit of thread locker, just enough to keep them from backing out. Tighten this one like pretty tight. Just before you get it fully tight, you can slide this like this to adjust the belt tension. And this one you want, you know, don't go too crazy, but just enough tension. It's hard to tell you how much tension to put on it. You know, you'll just have to kind of feel it out for yourself. The main thing is getting them both at the same tension. Pretty much the only way to tell is just pushing on the belt and seeing how much it moves, and then also just spinning it by hand. Like this one is spinning just a little bit easier than this one, so I'm going to go ahead and loosen it just like the smallest amount, and you can see how it adjusts here. Yeah, that seems better. Still about the same belt tension, but it spins easily. And you should be able to grab onto the big belt and use the big belt to move the whole transmission. It takes quite a bit of force too. But then also just check that nothing's rubbing on anything, because that's the most important thing. When you start driving outside, if for some reason you forgot a washer or something, it will not be good. So next we'll be putting the transmissions in the snowcat. So to get the cat ready for the transmission, we'll need these parts here. Take the 1/2-inch hex bar and fit it through the sprocket. And then take a washer and the socket head bolt here and put some thread locker on it so it doesn't back out, and screw that in on both ends. The next thing is these printed hex spacers. There's a thick one and then a thin one. The thin one goes on here like this, and then one of these bearings goes over it. Should have a bearing inside here. If you forgot that, you have a lot of pieces to take apart. Hopefully you did not forget that. And then we're going to load the thicker hex spacer inside like this, in that bearing. And then stick this just so it's flush in there. Just kind of leave it hanging like that. And one more thing is, if you're using the metal plate there, when you put on the spacers, this will all happen like inside the hull. I'm just showing you outside for ease of seeing. But there's a additional thin spacer which basically accounts for the thickness of the aluminum plate, and then that will go on before the pulley goes on. You know, when you're inserting the transmission, just make sure you put that in there. So I'll be showing you how to do this side, and the other side's the exact same, just flipped. So we're going to want to get the wires kind of out of the way and get ready to put the transmission down in here. But first we need to use the pulley here, the hex facing towards the sprocket. Just kind of set it in the belt like this, and then lower it down in here. And you gotta kind of tip it back to get these bolts to pop out those side holes there. And then the tricky part is getting this hex to line up with this hex. The way that I do it is I'll use like a flathead screwdriver and push the sprocket down in there, at the same time trying to find where the hex is on here. I'm like pushing in on this. There we go, I actually got it right there. You'll feel when it catches and then enters in that pulley. Takes a little bit of force and fiddling to get it in there. The next thing then is to put in this bolt on the other side. So right here is a hole, and it's an access hole to put this screw in the end of that shaft. So use some thread locker on that. So I'll tighten that all the way down. You can see as I'm tightening it that it's actually pulling the sprocket in. So then we'll need this hardware here. And those 3 bolts and washers will go in these 3 slots here. One here, here, and here. Feed the screw in, but don't fully tighten it. Also make sure you thread locker these as well. Once you have those in place, just loosely, 3 1/4 hex bolt and washers. And those screws will feed in through the hole here, through that printed part, and then into that lock nut. And here is where a extension socket wrench comes in useful. And then you're going to want to keep an eye on that nut, just to make sure it doesn't pop out or something. And then tighten the bolt so it gets close. So once the bolt is tight, this is how you adjust the tension on this first belt here. You can see it's way too loose. So to tighten it, you just turn that screw and depending on how loose it is, you'll have to go quite a bit. There we go, that's getting pretty tight. Might have went a little too far. I'm going to back it off just a little. And this one you want just a little bit of flex like that, but you can feel that it's like tight, like really tight. And then if you turn the sprocket by hand, you can see that, you know, it's not slipping or anything. After that is tight, then you'll want to finish tightening these 3 bolts that are on the outside. So now we have both transmissions installed. So using this hardware, and you only need these if you are doing the plastic hull version. I'll show you the differences in a second. But using this hardware, we're going to be putting in the mounting points for the all the top hull accessories. So you'll be running one of these screws through here like this with a spacer and lock nut. And then there's 8 of these going down all the sides of the hull. And if you're using the plastic hull instead of the aluminum upgrade, there's only one difference. The only difference on the plastic hull is when you get to the back end of the machine, where this plastic connection piece is, you'll be using a 1-inch screw instead of the 3/4, but other than that, everything is the same. So the last and most important thing for the chassis is the tracks. Currently I'm only offering 3D printed tracks. The 3D printed tracks work awesome. Check out this clip of me weight testing them. Here I have a test jig of just a couple links from the 2x Spyker cat here. And I'm going to do a similar stress test that I did on the Sherman a couple of videos back. So let's see how much weight these things can handle. These are only ABS 3D printed. So to assemble them, it's extremely simple. Your kit for the tracks will come with two bits, because these are like a hex screw, and follow the drill guide to drill the holes out on them, which is just 2 holes. The inner hole are a smaller diameter than the outer hole, using the guide over here. And then once you have them all drilled, to assemble them is extremely easy. Just line up the holes, and I normally start the screw by hand just so it holds on there, and then do that on each side. Leave them like a gap, kind of like that. Same with on the other side here. Just right before the screw touches the plastic, I normally stop. That way it's a nice free hinge. And then you just do that like 200 times, and then you have the tracks assembled. So when you have both tracks assembled and ready to install on the machine, first thing is to make sure that your idler tension is all the way this way. Saves a lot on your back. Also the count is you need 51 links, but then to attach it, I use the sprocket to help keep it together on each side. So then you'll need to adjust the track tension, because that is way too loose. And the way we do that is I'll loosen up this bolt a little bit more just to make it easier. And I would make it so if you like lightly pull up, that it comes to about the level of these screws. It should come about there or so. You just gotta kind of eyeball it, but that's a pretty good tension. You don't want it like super tight, but you do want it tight like this. And then just go ahead and screw that in to finish it off. So your machine is ready to go. One more thing is make sure that both tracks are about the same tension. It's good to keep it equal on both sides. Also, I run my tracks with the cleat facing this way, so it kind of like scoops down into the snow while it's driving. So yeah, that wraps up this assembly video. This video was only showing you how to put together the chassis. Check out my page and links down below for how to put together the different top bodies. There will also be a separate video for the blower lifting mechanism. It will either be in the snowblower video or the electronics video, or probably both, honestly. And also, this video is not covering the electronics. There will be a separate video for that. And yeah, leave me some comments and stuff. This video probably went extremely long, but hopefully I covered everything in detail enough so you guys can build your own. And I will also be selling exactly what you're seeing here on my website. You'll be able to get the kits from me, or ready to run with or without electronics. There's going to be so many options, so make sure to check out my site once I get this thing up for sale. And yeah, let me know any comments. So thanks for watching.